So welcome everyone. I'm Deborah Rohde, the director of the Center on the Legal Profession, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to a conversation that touches close to home. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers, but before I briefly introduce them, I just want to say a word of gratitude to Lucy Rita, who had the idea for this panel and did all the hard work of putting it together. So thank you for being the founding mother of this. The first panelist will be Jonathan Glader, who's visiting here this year from Irvine. His writing focuses on the role of law as both a response to and a source of barriers to higher education. Prior to joining the faculty there, he for 9 years worked as a reporter at the New York Times, where he wrote about the business of law and about higher education finance. Next to him is Frank Mercado, our very own member of the Stanford family. He joined the staff in 1983 as an assistant financial manager and now pretty much runs the place. During his years at the law school, he's credited with overseeing numerous building projects, including the classroom, library, clinic renovations, spearheaded the construction of the Munger graduate residence and the Newcomb building, and most relevantly for our purposes was the main architect of our loan forgiveness program. And finally, Leanne Black, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Latham Watkins, selected one of the most powerful and influential women of the tri-state area by the National Diversity Council. She has been at Latham as the Chief Operating Officer since 1999, overseeing all of their global operations and guiding all aspects of the firm's financial management. And she, most relevantly, has been involved in Latham's own innovative response to the debt load crisis. So we'll kick it off with a few opening comments by each of the panelists and then throw it open for a conversation with all of you. And we'll start with Jonathan.
Thank you, Deborah. It's an honor to be here and speak to you all today. I'm going to give a very brief overview of some of the issues before we start talking about a crisis, which is the word that gets thrown around a lot in this context. I want us to be clear on what the problem is. And the rhetoric here matters because often when there's conversation about a student debt crisis, there's an analogy to the mortgage crisis of a few years ago, and the implication is the solution ought to be the same, right? If we reduce the amount of borrowing, then we won't have the same kinds of problems. That's, of course, a regressive solution in this context. If we restrict the amount of credit available, who will not be able to go to college and law school? So I just first want to suggest to you that the crisis may not quite be what we initially think. So I have 11 slides here. I'm going to get through them in about 7 minutes. And the first 3 reflect different facets of the same thing, student loan default rates, right, which we might think of as a manifestation of the crisis. So if this is a crisis of students crushed by debt who then default on loans, this appears to be abating. You can see the default rates actually starting to decline last year, okay? This is a flawed statistic. Feel free to ask me about it in the Q&A, but the trend is indicative. Does anyone know Stanford's default rate? 0.8%. Does anyone know the law school's default rate? I didn't know that. I had to ask Frank, who tells me it's 0.05%. Okay, you guys are a good risk. It's a theme I want to come back to. Cohort default, this is too small. Graduate students, as you can see, the default rates are lower. The reason this is a better statistic is this is based on a lifetime of repayment, right? A 20-year repayment period. So it's a more accurate portrayal of what happens. And Michael Simkovich, the law professor at Seton Hall, actually backed out of Ed Department data the default rates for law students overall, and he comes up with a figure of around 2%. Okay, so this doesn't look quite like a crisis. There's arguably good news on higher ed funding. We can see that grant aid, that's the blue line in the middle, average grant aid is for graduate students is actually going up, while loan burdens are actually on a per student basis starting to go down. We don't know why. The total amount borrowed per year, and I'm happy to put any of these back up if anybody wants. Total amounts borrowed per year in the aggregate, we've also seen a slight decline. Okay, so is the per student amount. It's I don't have a slide for this. It's now about $16,500. It reached a high of a little over $18,000 a few years ago. Of course, these declines in borrowing may reflect the fact that more students with lesser financial resources are not bothering to go. That would be a less good indicator. There are not that many students out there with huge loan balances. I've pilfered a lot of these slides from the College Board. Sandy Baum, who's the economist who puts this all together for them, does a presentation that's literally called "What Crisis?" ? So the students with the huge loan balances get all the press. There just aren't that many of them. Not that we should ignore them, but there aren't that many of them. And good research has found that high loan balances do not correlate with the likelihood of default. In fact, people with smaller balances tend to be the borrowers who are more likely to default. Other things that correlate with likelihood of default are going to a for-profit institution, failure to complete a course of study. And we'll probably come back to some of those as well. So what then is the problem? Why are we here? We still have rising tuition. You have confronted this over the course of your academic careers, those of you who are law students here. But I'm suggesting that it's not the debt itself. I'm suggesting that the debt is a symptom of the problem. Students do not want to take on debt for college and law school. I know I didn't. And I just paid my loans off a few years ago. But that's a slightly different argument. That's an argument that we should not require students to borrow for law school, not that students can't afford to or can't manage it. So the cost for students continues to rise. It's rising faster than family or household incomes. It's rising faster than the rate of inflation. And why institutional costs go up, I'm going to defer on that one. To someone who knows it much better than I. But if I were going to ask him a question, I would probably zero in on faculty salaries and benefits. Just a suggestion. Debt burdens per graduate and in the aggregate do continue to go up, right? Even though we saw that slight downturn in recent years, it's still up significantly from where it was 10 and 20 years ago. So there's been this reallocation of costs to students and their families. Jobs are harder to come by. Some of you perhaps saw the National Law Journal's report, in particular on California job placement. I don't have a slide on this one. I couldn't figure out how to make it into a PDF. But they have found that it is more difficult for students to find jobs that actually put their law degrees to use in California. Legal education now looks riskier. So some students are deterred from even trying to go to law school. And disproportionately, these are the students who are more sensitive to debt, who are disproportionately recent immigrants, children of recent immigrants, and members of certain communities of color. What that means is the reliance on debt has certain implications for student body diversity and the diversity of the profession down the road. It also affects career decisions for those students lucky enough to have career decisions to make. I suspect I'm speaking to a room that has many such students. This is another possible topic for the Q&A. You should ask me about NYU's experiment where they switched between loans and grants and how that affected students' career choices. And finally, there are implications for access to justice. We need more lawyers who can provide legal services at lower costs. And it's not clear that this high price, high aid, high loan model, it helps to solve that problem. So what kinds of solutions are out there? I was asked to think a little bit about this. Employers can help, right? Sorry, wrong one. Employers can help. It's a smart recruiting and retention tool, and I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in a moment. Third-party investors are stepping in because they sense an opportunity for profits. And we can talk more about these income share. They used to be called human capital investing. That term seems to have fallen a bit out of favor. Now it's an income share agreement. Purdue University is testing this out and got some press around it a few weeks ago. The problem is these are not necessarily systemic fixes. They help specific students. The best risks for investors are going to be those students who would be at the lowest risk of default in the first place. So the private sector solutions may not help all the students we want to reach. And they also may not encourage law school graduates to pursue public service careers to the extent that we view indebtedness as a tool to steer students to help fill that access to justice gap. Now the news you can use, which I can't, anyway. So there's movement by the federal government to decrease the negative effects of indebtedness, most notably income-linked repayment plans. This is the Federal Education Department, so instead of there being one generous program, there's 4, which is why the slide looks the way it does. But it's still beneficial. Everyone who is borrowing should enroll in these programs, which can effectively cap your obligation to repay your federal student loans at 10% of income. What that means, there's the important tip, is you should only be using federal student loans for which these programs are available. So not parent loans, not private loans. These programs disproportionately are going to benefit the students who borrow larger amounts, right? So it favors law students. We can question the policy wisdom of this, but while we question, you guys should take advantage, right? This is a very generous, generous program. And finally, there's public service loan forgiveness, which exists both at the institution level, at wealthier institutions like this one, and also at the federal level. So this is just a very quick overview of this enormously complex and shifting legal and policy morass. I haven't talked about the for-profit sector. I haven't talked about bankruptcy treatment of student loans. I haven't talked about fraud litigation ongoing, or the criticisms of legal education by various law professors and so on. But I haven't touched on that because I know our panel is going to solve all of this in the next hour. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
So I'll just say something briefly about law school costs. And again, I do this from the vantage point of Stanford. I can't speak for all law schools, but just like Jonathan said, I mean, the driver of our budgets are salaries, both staff and faculty. Those probably know, we try to keep tuition increases at a minimum. I think it's been 3.5% for as long back as I can remember here, which kind of ties to our salaries. And by no means are we leaders in salaries, both on staff and faculty. In both cases, we try to do what we can to stay competitive in the markets. You know, again, hiring here in the Silicon Valley is not easy, and then again, amongst top law schools is not easy. So to hold it at 3% would actually be impossible if it wasn't for our alumni and donors. And so, every time we talk about tuition to anyone who will listen, I make the comment and reminder that tuition doesn't come near covering the cost of an education at a place like Stanford. It's like 35% or something like that. The rest of it is coming from donors, both who've given in the past, which is now endowment, or gifts. And without that, the cost would be tuition costs would be far greater than they are now. And then secondly, I do want to say something about the loan forgiveness programs, which Stanford Law School was the first to create an actual loan forgiveness program. And I still believe ours is the most generous in the country, and I do believe the government programs are great too. We're actually trying to look at it, is there a way for us to marry the two a little bit to benefit our students even a little bit more? But even as they stand now, our loan forgiveness program payout per year to graduate the program is higher than any other law school. I think it's close to about 18,000 right now. So that said, we're doing all we can, and again, we're incredibly fortunate at a place like Stanford. I think those of you know that we just in the last handful, 10 years, we've done so much more to provide so much more to students, whether it be clinics or global courses or the law and policy programs, and I can go on with the services. Even it's funny as I look here at the chairs. I remember when we had far less expensive chairs, and we actually had lots of issues with carpal tunnel syndrome and other things for students. And so we moved to better facilities and more rooms, and so I can go on and on with a list of amenities and things provided. And I think law schools, in this competitive world, continually try to provide more and more to students, which definitely is part of that cost.
Great, Leanne.
So I'm not an expert on the debt crisis. I'm here to actually just talk about what our firm, Latham Watkins, did to try to assist our associates with their debt, which was quite substantial. So about 18 months, we implemented a program. I actually went out to a number of banks trying to forge a relationship to see if we could bundle some of the federal debt that our associates had. Many banks were not interested. In particular, the larger banks, it's harder for them to steer a ship in a different direction, and they had a lot of compliance issues and really weren't that interested. I did then work with First Republic Bank, and as I said, about 18 months ago, we developed a program for our associates with the bank. We obviously looked at all of the loan documents for them and implemented a program where they could rebundle their student debt. There were some parameters that they had to, reach, and the first one was they had to have at least $60,000 in debt, and they were willing to lend between $60,000 and $300,000. The rates were obviously in a very low rate environment. These are fixed rates, and the rates ranged from below 2% to about 3.5%. And so 18 months later, we have more than 150 associates that have borrowed and rebundled their federal loans, and it's in excess of about $23 million in debt and about $4 million in interest savings to our associates. So it was a very substantial program. We have academies where our associates come in from all around the world, and so we made it easy for them by having the bankers at those types of events so that they could actually do it while they were participating in these events. The one thing that First Republic did was they wanted to make sure that they met every person who was, going through this transaction. They wanted to look at them face to face, eye to eye. They wanted to build a rapport and relationship with them because their goal ultimately was to build a long-term relationship with these folks because, these are obviously very talented associates, and whether they stay at Latham or go in-house or do something else in their career, they felt that the risk was definitely worth it for them. So we have a really nice program. As I said, lots of savings. The firm was not providing comfort letters on the loans. It was really more a risk of the bank. The one thing we did do for our associates was if they didn't meet the liquidity provision, we gave the bank comfort on that, which allowed them to go forward. We also have another relationship with a group called SoFi, which is available to anybody. And but what they did was augment our program with First Republic, so they allowed for loans that were less than $60,000. They allowed for loans to our expat community in our European offices. The rates are competitive, not as low as First Republic, but quite competitive. So a number of our associates went down that path as well. But all in all, just a really robust program. There's no prepayment penalties. The only issue for associates is you lose your status that you would have with a federal loan. So if for whatever reason you were unemployed, you wouldn't have that guarantee on the federal loan program. That was, in big print. So our associates knew that they were, taking that risk themselves, but some of them were going from 7.5% or 8% loans down to 1.8 or something like that. So it was just a huge benefit. Since that time, a number of firms have called and talked to me, and we've, I in particular have steered them in the direction of First Republic. So I think a number of the other law firms are starting to use them and maybe explore the same opportunity with other banks. But I think, Jonathan, you started this off by saying the risk for for folks coming out of Stanford and from so many other wonderful schools is low. And so, I'm sure that's the conversation the bankers had at First Republic, which has allowed them to implement this program. So it was a nice success for our team.
Great. So, unless you all have any questions to ask each other, we can open it up to all of you. Come to the microphones, because we're recording this, if you wouldn't mind.
Hi.
I'm an LLM student here from Canada, and I'd like to hear more about the NYU study. So in Canada, this is sort of, it's not quite as extreme a situation as here, and law schools, though, are not as sophisticated as they are here in terms of loan forgiveness and programs. So I'd like to hear what NYU.
So NYU had a natural experiment where one of their public interest fellowships, they had two basically economically equivalent aid packages for students that were going to go into the public interest. One gave you a grant up front, and one gave you a loan and then repaid it at the back end. And so if we're all rational, all law students are totally rational. So if you're a rational actor, it should make nobody laughed at that. That's what's really interesting, right? It should make no difference, right? But what they in fact found was that the students who received the grant were it was small, but statistically significantly more likely to pursue a career in the public interest relative to the students who received the loans that would have been forgiven. Yeah, there's a paper by Cecilia Rouse, I think, but if you ask me afterwards, I can find it for you.
Stunned silence.
We did solve everything. That's what happened.
I would like to say something about, when we're talking about debt, Jonathan had referred to using government loans to make sure they fall into the government forgiveness programs, and you mentioned SoFi, and I think it is important. I don't think students pay enough attention to the types of loans they're borrowing and where they might go, particularly public interest. As I said, we have a very generous loan forgiveness program, but are looking at the government loans, and there's no question, the more I study those government loan forgiveness programs and the public service loan forgiveness program, they're very good. And so you should give a lot. So again, if you're thinking public service, you should give a lot more thought to making sure the loans stay in the federal loan programs. And there are great. Disclaimer: the Stanford Law School is a part owner of SoFi, so I'm not pushing it as a part owner, but groups like SoFi I think have done a great job of trying to be competitive and get rates, and I think the World of First Republic too. I think they do a lot of good things. So,
I think one of the things a number of the associates looked at was they took 10-year debt and they brought it down to 5-year debt because they were able to bring the interest rate below 2%. So it was a great way for them to just get it off the table.
Having studied this debt for some time, but a couple things I was surprised about as Stanford at times has tried to work with banks, just like you did with First Republic. We used to have a program with Citibank. Is that I learned two things that are interesting. One, our default rate was incredibly low, and banks were very interested in our students as lenders. But also that even with the high debt, the average forgiveness period was 7 years that our graduates were paying back their debt, even though you're taking 10, 15-year debts to start. Most were paying off by 7 years, which was surprising to me.
Can you say a word, Frank? You mentioned you were looking at the relationship between loan forgiveness, our loan forgiveness programs, and the federal program, and I've never quite understood how it works.
Sure. So our program started over 20 years ago, and federal programs didn't exist. And the way our program works is very simple. If you go into public service work or government work or even private practice that does pro bono or public service work, you qualify for our loan forgiveness program, and then based on your income, the law school gives you a loan, which then after a year we forgive. And the important reason for doing a loan and not a grant is that loan forgiveness is tax exempt. So we give you a loan to help pay off your debt. When the government stepped in and created their own loan forgiveness programs and IBR, income-based repayment, we looked closely at it, but at the time, we still felt our program was very generous. We had the funding in place, and we've maintained it. But as we look at it, and the programs mature, and there's always that question of, well, will they just pull the rug out from under graduates' feet, and the programs go away or get reduced or capped, or all these different discussions going on? We were hesitant to point our students towards those programs. But now as programs get a little more mature, we're now looking at them to see, well, is there a way to kind of, maybe not marry the two, but help use the federal program for our graduates so that some of their loans are forgiven through the government program, in addition to still getting support from Stanford. So again, we're early in that review, but
Yeah, well, that would seem to make sense, yes.
Hi, yeah. Forgive me because my question isn't necessarily fully formed, but just listening to these comments and looking at the presentation, it's I'm glad to see, especially the chart of like most loans are smaller amounts. It is like cold comfort, someone sitting in this room who wants to do public interest, that I'm in like the 1% or whatever. It's like really scary, and I think that's part of my issue right now, is even though, and it seems like part of what's being suggested here is these government programs are really good, even if you want to be public interest. But so I don't know if there's just a disconnect between the not description of those government programs, but the communication to students. But I know that, at least for myself, and I think for other students in my position, there's still a lot of like fear around this. So in terms of like thinking about solutions and reform, is part of it like what this NYU study is saying, of like front ending to grants to make students have less stress? That sounds like from a tax standpoint it might not make sense. Is there a potential to be reducing this load? Because it's kind of crazy to me that I'll be graduating with like $300,000 in debt. That's a ton of money. So I just was kind of wondering, other than just pointing to the government programs, what are we thinking, or maybe even bundling with banks? It's still not necessarily getting at that, like, does the communication just need to be to students, you're going to graduate with this much debt, but look, all of these things should make you feel better about it? Or how should we be approaching that?
So my first from the hip response is vote, if you know what I mean. So the question of why so much of the cost of higher education in general has been shifted over the past 60 years onto students. This is a shift, right? It wasn't always this way, right? This is a matter of policy, some deliberate, some of it kind of accidental. So to the extent that you want to shift more of that policy, more of those costs away from students, vote for people who are in favor of reducing those costs to the students. But yes, if you have $300,000 in student loan debt, these programs, they help, right? In particular, the income-linked repayment program, that's a pretty generous program the more debt you carry. But there's a psychological cost to being indebted. And there's actually growing research on this, because it exacts a cost on the student while in school, because students will worry. I worried in law school, right, about the fact that I'm racking up this debt, and it's taking away time and energy that could have been spent on something else. The question is, from a policy perspective, what can we do, right, as you suggest, what can we do to mitigate? So if Stanford were to provide grants ex ante, right, grants to you instead of asking you to borrow to cover some portion, some fraction of tuition, and those convert to loans if your income is above some certain level, that's a relatively straightforward policy fix. And we do that, right? We do that with Teach grants already. So there's precedent for that kind of program. Those are directions we could move. Those are directions that periodically are discussed in Washington. But there's been, where the movement has so far been coming from is from the executive, from the education department, through these programs that don't require some kind of legislative approval. Which brings me back to my initial point, vote.
I have to make one comment, because I start to worry as much as you when you have $300,000 in debt, because if you make $50,000 or less, we pay all of it. But that said, of course, it's still the burden's on you, and we understand that's why we're trying to be as aggressive as we can with our loan forgiveness program and see what we can do with the government programs to help ease that. Because again, $50,000 and below, it's great. Our program is fabulous, but as your salary starts to go up, you pay more and more of that, and so that's what we're trying to address, is help you as your salary goes up as a graduate.
I was a little mystified by your default rate slide, because so much of the literature on this reports that a large percentage of graduates are getting jobs at which they can't afford to pay their loans off. And you see varying percentages, but I've seen percentages as high as 40%. Is that just, hype and sloppy reporting by the media? Or, what explains the mismatch between the rhetoric around this? I was thinking of the slide that showed about, the small number of people at the big indebtedness.
Oh, the pie chart.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So the media does focus on the people with the heaviest debt burdens, right? So that seems to be shaping a lot of the popular discussion, although not really driving policy, which is probably right given the small number of students who are affected. But there have been studies in particular of law schools, right? The studies that have found what share of students are graduating and are working full-time as lawyers and what they can afford. I'm not sure that's the same problem, right? I mean, the burden of repayment is incidental to the problem of finding a job. And you have the advantage of these income-based repayment programs if you have federal loans, regardless, right? I mean, your payment then would just be zero, which can happen. So there's a lot of hype. There's a lot of attention to law schools and law school outcomes. And David Siegel's pieces a few years ago, a bit of a broad impact, right? Questioning the value proposition, quote unquote, of law school. But I think the aggregate, when you look at the big picture, it's less clear that there's a crisis, and that's why I wanted to start by posing the question, should we think about this as a crisis, and what are the implications if we do?
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification, this is all
This is not just law schools. This is everything,
right?
yeah.
So I assume law school is
I looked on the College Board site to see if they broke it out even by graduate versus undergraduate. They don't have it broken out this way, unfortunately. I assume the balances are higher, right?
I can tell you just from my experience at Latham Watkins, we have 1,400 associates, say. More than 150 took advantage of our program. The average loan was $150,000. The median was higher. It was like 180. So, it's much more than 1%. It's closer to 15%.
Right, but what's the income of a first-year associate?
160.
So that's it's a particular income profile. So the research shows that the students who have borrowed the larger amounts are disproportionately students who come from higher income backgrounds to begin with, and disproportionately it's students with graduate and professional degrees who have higher earning profiles anyway. So Michael Simkovich, who backed out this number, the law school default rate, he tried to look at what is the actual outcome for students who go to law school, what's the lifetime impact on earnings. The reassuring news for you is it's still a very, very good deal to go to law school on average, and it's a very, very, very good idea to go to this law school in particular on average.
And then our firm on average.
Yeah, well, I don't even need to say on average. Yeah.
So I have a couple questions, and apologies, they're similarly potentially not very well formed, but I'm a 3L and I'm about to be out of here in a few months, or less than that actually. And I was at our class gift thing up on Newcomb Terrace a few weeks ago, and they were all talking about how, like you said, tuition only covers 30, 40%, whatever. And my reaction to that is, well, why is that my problem? I mean, I pay like $55,000 a year for the past 3 years to come here, plus room and board living in Munger, which ends up making it about $80,000 a year. And I guess my question is, if $55,000 a year times 700-something students here in Stanford Law School isn't enough to pay for more than 30% of sort of what's going on, where the hell is the money going? Like, why is it so goddamn expensive? It's incredibly frustrating. I mean, it seems like you're getting very poor value for the money that we're putting in here, and are there some kind of inefficiencies? I mean, I know that the cost of attendance at law school relative to the rate of inflation in real terms has skyrocketed over the past 10, 15, 20 years. And so what the heck is going on?
Yeah, so I get to it because trust me, I love efficiencies. I spend a lot of my day trying to find more efficiencies, and there are some times when I got to admit we try not to be efficient to help students. Like, perfect example, I'll just give you one little minor one, is the course material fee. There used to be we charge per course material and copyright and all of that, and there were long lines down in the copy center. And so by doing one fee and just letting people print and get the course material fee, it's not efficient, but sure saves a lot of your time. So going to the cost, when you say, where's all this money going? First, I agree. Education is very expensive. If you look at just not just Stanford, but any college campus, right? To pay for the roads, and they're not public roads. To pay for the roads, the buildings, you just start from the facilities up, then you get to the personnel. When you say it's not efficient, look at the cost of education at any university, whether it's public school. You go to any school. If the cost is, and tuition doesn't cover the cost almost anywhere. So therefore, to say, why is the cost $80,000 to $100,000 per person? It's like, I can't quite answer that. That is the cost. You can look at any university in the world. That's kind of the cost. And so there isn't a lot I could do about that. Now, you're right. Places like Stanford provide, higher quality faculty, and they cost a little bit more, and better facilities, and those cost a little bit more. But what's funny is, on average, as you probably know, tuition at Stanford is less than most, kind of secondary law schools where they rely on the tuition. So when you say, well, what are we getting for the money? I think if you look at any educational institution, because they all cost X amount, if X amount is 80, 100,000, like that's the cost. So, I think we could all get very frustrated about it, but I don't think you're going to change that until you change how the education is delivered, right? So if it's online, it's going to be a lot less expensive. So if you have one faculty member teaching 5,000 students, absolutely it's going to be less expensive. But as long as we do it in this model where we have, seminars and you have class size the way we have it, that's the cost. I can assure you that's the cost. And definitely that's not the most efficient way to provide education. Online would definitely be more efficient, but until the day gets there where schools are doing that, I think this is the cost we're bearing.
Well, at the risk of biting the hand that feeds me, let me just suggest that part of the problem is the fact that you guys are subsidizing our very comfortable lifestyle and our research. Our teaching load here is one course a quarter. How much time is that out of my life? Part of the reason why we have such an expensive system of legal education is that people who drive a lot of those decisions benefit from it, and the loans availability has made it possible to shift that cost to students. And in an ideal world, I don't think we'd be living like this, honestly. And what's particularly problematic about the way that the ABA accreditation systems work is that it isn't very easy for a law school to decide it's going to reduce the cost substantially and switch to an alternative model. There's a real collective action problem there. Unless everybody does that, they're going to lose out to the competition, and they're forced by the accreditation standards to do certain things in really expensive ways. And that's everything from per student, faculty-student ratios to the amount of time that you can require for classroom instruction, to the physical facilities. We have this kind of one-size-fits-all model of legal education, which is extremely expensive. 3 years delivered in the form that we now deliver it by a faculty that does other things with its free time apart from teaching. If you had 1-year programs, 2-year programs, 3-year programs, more competition in the market in terms of different models of legal education, I think we'd find it much easier to address some of those problems that Jonathan focused on at the beginning: lack of access to justice. It's a shameful irony that the country with the most expensive system of legal education does such a terrible job of providing legal aid to the people who need it most. We've priced graduates out of the market for what a lot of low-income folks need. So, just from my own perspective, I think the system is fundamentally broken, and it's hard to know what any individual school can do to break out of that model, but the model itself is deeply flawed.
Can I just respond
Yeah.
briefly? So I want to break your question into two parts, really, because one of them is, why does it cost so much? And I strongly recommend a book by a guy named Ron Ehrenberg at Cornell, which is called Tuition Rising, Why Does College Cost So Much? And it's the clearest kind of walking through of what are the drivers of institutional costs. And it kind of makes the point that education is still this artisanal product. We haven't figured out how to mass produce education, right? There's something about the teacher in the room talking to the students that seems to matter, and people seem willing to pay a lot for it. But the bigger question, I would argue, if I were a student again, my question would not be, why does it cost so much? I'm happy to have you spend as much as you want on educating me. I'm all for the maximum being spent on my education. My question is, why am I paying it? Right? Why is it structured so that the student is expected to shoulder the burden that the student is currently expected to shoulder? Right? Why isn't more of this cost spread across the community that's going to benefit from the education you're going to receive?
Well,
right?
The other thing is, though, why has it gotten so much more expensive over the past 10, 15 years?
This is a misconception. This is what's really interesting. So if you go back and look at the Higher Education Act debates back in the early 60s, right, when they passed the Higher Ed Act that gave us kind of the seedling for the student aid program we have now, they're in there ranting about how much college costs. It's $1,500 a year for a kid. So I'm not exaggerating. And they taught, and incomes were obviously much lower, but this concern about college costs outstripping growth in income and outstripping the inflation rate goes back decades. It's a constant problem. And it's one of the reasons the federal government intervened to provide these aid and grant programs in the first place.
That was kind of what I wanted to follow up with, the historical growth. And thank you so much, Professor Rohde, for your honesty. And I wanted to ask if you think that a bulk of that growth is mainly from the growth in faculty, teaching and research, salaries, and or the ABA, like the restrictive requirements and one-size-fits-all issue. Is it both? What percentage of, or what sense of cause is from both?
Yeah, well, one other elephant in the room is the U.S. News and World Report rankings, which have had a really perverse effect on costs, because they reward institutions for example, spending more per pupil, and they make 40% of schools' rankings depend on these very fuzzy reputational indices, which are sort of vaguely tied to faculty scholarly reputation. And in my own view, in an ideal world, you would not have all law schools trying to be like Stanford in terms of providing first-class research. I mean, the world of legal academia is strewn with law review articles that should never have been published, and read by no one, cited by no one, maybe the author's mother. But that energy could go into teaching, higher loads, doing more clinical instruction, more skills instruction, things that provide real value to students. So I think those are some of the things we need to fix, and breaking the U.S. News and World Report stranglehold, which forces a lot of institutions into an arms race of expenditures, would be a step in the right direction, although how you begin to do that is really difficult. I imagine that pretty much everybody in this room was well aware of where Stanford's ranking was when they decided where to go to law school.
Andrew's very tall. I'm curious about what you think will happen to the government programs if banks are successful in poaching all the low-risk loan participants. I mean, I don't know how rates could sustainably stay at 8% if all the low-risk people who fund those are removed. And I'm also curious, as somebody who's going to go work at a big firm with six-figure debt, what I'm supposed to expect to do if the economy turns bad. I just refinanced, took away my government protection, and my firm kicks me to the curb.
So I'll take the first part. Okay. In terms of if the private sector were to be successful, and there are a number of legal risks involved in these income share agreements, and we're going to have to see how those develop. But the federal government now collects north of 80% on student loans, that's a really high recovery rate. So even if the students who are the best, or the borrowers who are the best risks were siphoned off into the private sector, it's an empirical question. What would the recovery rate look like for the balance, right? And from the perspective of a borrower, I don't know that you care, right? You're going to make...
To the extent that the government's willing to keep...
Right, meaning the taxpayer.
Sure.
Right. One of the nice things about and I'm not suggesting this is why this is happening this way, but one of the nice things about the income-linked repayment plans is it pushes off the time of paying the piper by several years, right? Which also makes it a little more difficult to anticipate the cost, if any, to the taxpayer, right? So we don't know, right? And the more opaque that is, the less, yeah.
I'd like to say one thing about our loan forgiveness program. I mean, it doesn't matter what kind of debt it is, federal, private. You could borrow from your family, and we count it as debt. And you have 5 years to enter it. So if you lose your job before that 5-year window, you can enter public service government work, and Stanford will help you with that debt. And again, hopefully, one of the nice things about being a Stanford graduate is you'll be employable.
I think at the law firm, well, I'll just speak from our experience. When we implemented our programs, we were quite clear about what the downfall is of the program, so that folks who entered in it did so with their eyes wide open. Having said that, both SoFi and First Republic talked to our associates about, understanding the issues associated with different decision making that might come into play if they were to, gain employment somewhere else that was, had lower salaries, et cetera. I think SoFi has a wonderful but a period of time in which they'll let, lapse while someone is not employed. So I just think it's really important to understand each of the programs. Others have mentioned this earlier on having clear communication and making sure people are making good decisions, at the time.
Can I ask, so are these education loans technically that
No, they're private
they're just
loans.
Private commercial loans,
Yeah.
which means they're dischargeable in bankruptcy without the hurdles you have to put up with if it were an education loan?
I don't know the answer to that for sure. That's an interesting question.
One of your associates is researching that right now. Okay.
So I've heard a lot that one of the most important things is to be informed, and that I appreciate the sentiment, but that basically seems to be an impossible task for most law students. These are incredibly complicated financial options that you're kind of being tasked to evaluate, and a lot of law students I don't think have any financial
clearly we need to do a better job if you don't know fully kind of all the variables. But before everybody graduates, if you're on debt, you do go to a kind of a mandatory meeting that talks about a lot of these options for you as you go out, and you can consolidate or do different things. So all that's explained to you. But I think earlier on, we could probably do a better job letting people know the options, particularly now that as we've gotten more focused about federal versus non-federal when it comes to the government loan forgiveness programs. We'll do that.
I mean, if you wanted like the Michael Pollan boiled down, borrow as little as you can, all federal, do the income-linked repayment plans. That's kind of that's on a flashcard. That's how it stands right now.
Hello, thank you for participating. My first question is, do you think the rate of increases in law school tuitions are sustainable over the long run, given the stagnation in a lot of salaries for lawyers both in the private and public sector? And my second question is, are there any law schools in particular or people who are leading the charge to reform this sort of never-ending increase in tuition?
I go first. So, again, as a numbers person, when you look at it numerically, you think, well, it can't, right? At some point, something's got to give. I don't know when that is, and I'm confident it won't hit the top law schools first, but it'll hit law schools at some point. But if everything stayed on the same trajectory, it can't sustain itself. I think that's an accurate statement. I don't know quite. Well, clearly something will happen in that time, and I'm not sure what.
Yeah, and I think law schools at the bottom of the status pecking order are feeling it now. I mean, a lot of them are in really precarious situations. And I think if we continue on this trajectory, you're going to see some more law schools closing because they just can't manage it given the challenging job environment for their graduates and their dependence on tuition revenues. So I don't think it's sustainable. There are some reform organizations that are focused on legal education. I can't tell you that they've had a lot of impact on any of the players, and trying to get the ABA to change course on this issue seems to me just hopeless, in a word. Things would have to get really, really bad before you saw any significant movement around accreditation standards, and that more than anything else is what I think is getting in the way of fundamentally rethinking the structure of legal education.
So can I take a crack? I want to again, playing law professor, break your question into two parts. One is this model sustainable for the institutions, right? And I think Deborah's exactly right. There are institutions that will not be able to persist at the current pace of tuition increases and the declining number of students that are going. From the student perspective, my fear is that this is totally sustainable. That's my fear, right? That's what I'm worried about. Is that as long as the credit, the credit limits are high enough, right? That they're what's the effective constraint? There is, however, the prospect for constraints imposed through reform, not from the institution side, but from politics, right? So some of the, I think it's the Sanders plan with respect to undergraduate education, radically reducing the costs if you attend public sector institutions. That's a serious threat to private sector institutions. They're going to have to do something about the price that they charge, right? If I'm understanding the plan correctly. So there's that kind of competitive constraint that could conceivably be imposed. But it's going to be very difficult. I mean, which law school is going to volunteer first to radically reshape its offerings to reduce its costs, which is a subsidy to the wealthier students already? Which law professors are going to step forward and say, yeah, I'll take a salary cut, right, in order to reduce the cost of providing the education that's provided? I'm not sure how that's what's gonna cause that kind of change to affect.
Well, that's kind of a dispiriting note on which to end. But I guess I will suggest that those of you who care about this issue need to keep caring about it. You know, once you're no longer sort of right in the, heart of the difficulties that we've imposed on you, because the only way to really make change is to, as Jonathan put it earlier, vote or put pressure on the bar organizations to rethink the structure of legal education. Yeah.
Has there been any serious discussion about integrating like what they do in medical school with some type of year residency or third year being integrated to do pro bono or some type of collaboration with pro bono clinics and so forth, and facilitating Triberville and whatever being done in California, how to integrate that would seem like a great place to start in that direction.
Yeah. Well, there are no lack of innovative models out there. And, changing the third year so that it was more based on externships and placements in real world settings would be a step in the right direction from my point of view.
Is there resistance from right now from the top law schools for changing the curriculum, or who are responsible for trying to get those grants or foster those relationships with the government?
I didn't quite hear that.
Who would be that's responsible, so to speak, from the law school side to try to foster those relationships, get the grants, or try to make that type of development happen? Or is there resistance from
Well, the faculty as a whole isn't so eager to get rid of its third year of law school for some very obvious self-interested reasons.
Or what about a fourth year?
Well, yeah. Yeah, I don't see a lot of student demand for that opportunity.
But I meant like a residency intern, so to speak, at a level of law where the loan would be forbeared for interest not growing on the loan, and that would almost compromising how the legal community, the poverty, legal poverty need to help subsidize part of the education and part of the transition into profession.
Yeah. Well, there have been some proposals along those lines to, set up more fellowships for students to, in effect, right after graduation, go to work in low-income communities. But, they're starved for resources. And, this is a country that has cut the Legal Services Corporation budget for legal aid, by a third over the last couple decades. So, I just don't see the political will to make that happen at the moment. But you guys are the ones who could change all that. So go forth and make things better.
That is the model. That's it outside of the U.S. So in Germany, they have the Referendar program. In the UK, the stagiaires that come in, or in Paris, the stagiaires, and so they're working for, depending upon which country, they're working for a year, and it's all about experiential learning, and they're being paid, not a great deal of money, but they're being paid.
Yeah, that's right. It seems like the only barrier is that nobody's really put a lot of effort to try to make it happen. That there's motivation yet from either side to kind of push to try to foster that relationship, whether it's political or who pushes that relationship. And certainly it doesn't seem like there's a lot more benefits than negatives, which I really don't see much negative.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And thanks to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.